thank you for giving me the opportunity to listen to this fascinating discussion and presentations that we've had. I'm also very impressed with you, Emilia, how you've switched from various different languages completely fluently. So it's been really an honor to be hearing those stories. What I'll do is very briefly some of the takeaways that I've taken from this discussion, and I'm quite new to the discussion on local government, because what we do, and I had the unit in International IDEA that produces a global state of democracy report. We look mostly at national level democracy, but of course local democracy is an important component of the health of a country's democracy. So what I hear from the speakers today is a number of challenges and opportunities that the COVID-19 crisis has presented for local democracy. And in terms of the opportunities, I think they've already been mentioned, but very briefly, it's about strengthening new practices and innovating in ways that local democracy can be practiced, bringing citizens closer to local governments through technology. Also very interesting stories about how solidarity has been strengthened during this crisis. So bringing people closer together in that sense, and also collaborating more across sectors with civil society organization. So those are some of the great opportunities that the difficulties of the situation has presented, but also in terms of the challenges, there are many. Apart from the health challenge itself, the challenges that the situation has presented for local democracy, and maybe linking those discussions to also the challenges at the level of national democracy that we see. And what I'll do is just very quickly give you some data that we have produced on what was the situation of democracy globally before the pandemic broke out at the end of 2019, and how is that health of global democracy affected by the crisis, and looking at some of the data. And so what we saw at the end of 2019 were three key characteristics of democracy at the global level, and there were some important trends that we could see across all regions. We saw that while democracy has continued to the number of democracies have continued to increase over the last decades, there has been a very significant erosion of the quality of democracy across all regions of the world. And so we see that in terms of the increase in the share of weak democracies, those democracies that have weak formal and informal democratic institutions and processes. It's around a quarter of all democracies in the world. But we also see a decreasing quality in the world's high-performing democracies, the older democracies in the world. And actually the share of high-performing democracies was at the end of 2019 lower than the share of weak democracies. The other thing that we see is as an increase in democratic erosion across all countries of the world as well, and across all regions. We see actually in our data that in the last decade, there's been a doubling of the countries experiencing democratic erosion. Half of the democracies in the world actually were at the end of 2019 experiencing democratic erosion and democratic backsliding as well, which is really where there is intentional attempt to crack down on civil liberties and to undermine checks on governments. And what we see in International IDEA is that these tendencies that were existing around the world before the COVID-19 crisis broke out, they will be worsened to some extent by the crisis. Now in consolidated older democracies, we know that there's been a restriction on civil liberties such as freedom of movement, but we know that those measures are temporary. But the risk is that in countries that had weak democratic systems, where we saw significant backsliding before the COVID-19 crisis broke out, the risk is that those measures are maintained beyond what is necessary to curb the pandemic. What we also see is that countries that were non-democratic before, clearly non-democratic before the crisis broke out, they are taking the opportunity also to implement very repressive measures that will lead to a deepening of their autocratization. Now, what we see also in our data, and I'll end with that, is that the aspects of democracy that are being most affected during the pandemic are, of course, related to freedom of movement, but also to freedom of expression. Around 30% of countries in the world, we have calculated, have taken measures, either passing laws or using existing laws to crack down on freedom of expression. And that's particularly worrisome because freedom of information, freedom of expression is particularly important in a time of a pandemic where academics, researchers need to share the important findings of their academic studies on the pandemic, and citizens and journalists need to have critical voices around how governments are managing the pandemic, and that's important for oversight. So just in terms of some of the challenges that we are seeing right now to national level democracy, which many of those patterns are also seen at the local level. But I'll end with that. But I think I'm ending with the challenges, but I would really like to say how impressed I am to hear all the stories from around the world of how the opportunity of the crisis, the crisis and the challenges presented by the crisis has presented opportunities also that are really tapped into to try to implement practices and bring about a new normal that is better than the normal that we had before. Thank you very much.